Welcome back. I don't think I can think of anything more frightening than the possibility of being seduced into joining a group like a cult and having that cult take years off of your life, trapping you, abusing you, and then suddenly finding a way to get out of the cult only to find that you have no idea where to start. How do you rebuild your life? This, of course, is a fascinating topic, the topic of cults, but I also think it's one that is very important to speak about. Although cults might not be the most common experience that people can go through, it has been estimated that there can be hundreds of cults operating in the UK at any one point in time. And therefore, I think it's important in the psychology and mental health world that we talk about them, have an awareness of them, and have the awareness that humans have a very specific vulnerability to joining groups like this, cults. Also, they can be called high-demand groups. Joining us again to talk about cults is Gillie Jenkinson. She is a psychotherapist and counsellor with more than 30 years of experience. She specialises in working with survivors of cults, and she herself has lived experience of being in a cult and suffering abuse at the hands of a cult. This is part 2 of my conversation with Gillie. I would highly recommend you go back to part 1, which is episode 140, released about a month ago. And in that podcast, we just go over Gillie's story, how she became involved in a cult, what that was like for her, the dynamic of the group, and how she eventually got out. Today, in part 2, we'll be discussing cults from a more theoretical perspective. How can we define a cult? What's the difference between a cult that can do harm to people and an organization that's more beneficial for people? Important red flags that might suggest that a group is likely to be a cult. The importance of critical thinking. Gillie's specific psychotherapeutic process and the 4-stage recovery plan she walks people through when they're recovering from being in a cult. The dangers of relapse after you've escaped from a cult. The principles of so-called thought reform or brainwashing, and much more. This is The Thinking Mind, a podcast all about psychology, psychiatry, mental health, therapy, and much more. If you want to check out even more Thinking Mind content, you can check out our blog on Substack, and I'll put a link to that in the description. Once again, thank you very much for listening. And now here's today's conversation with Gillie Jenkinson. Thank you so much for joining me again.
You're welcome.
Last time we had the opportunity to discuss a bit about your story, what it was like to be part of a cult in Britain in the 1970s. And it was a difficult story, a story me and the listeners really appreciated that you were able to share. And of course, now we have the opportunity to discuss things from a bit more of a theoretical perspective, like what is a cult? What should people know about them? And a bit about your therapeutic process as well. To start, it would be really helpful to get your definition of a cult. How should people define cults?
Well, there are a number of definitions, but, basically a cult is an organisation which it always has some kind of hierarchy. Often there's one leader, often there's a board, like a governing body or a board of leaders. Some groups are still highly influenced by the founder, even if the founder is like 5 generations away. So this sort of control kind of percolates down through the system. There are very often layers of leadership, especially in the larger groups. There's a real micromanaging of life, and I hope that came through telling my story. What you eat, what you wear, who you have sex with or not allowed to have sex. Really, really minute detail of your life that's controlled. And then a cult will control who you have contact with. And you often hear of families losing their children to a cult, and that their child's been cut off from them. And from the inside, that same experience, we call it dispensing of existence. Robert J. Lifton's 8 components of thought reform. And So, this sort of outsiders don't have any truth or anything to offer us.
How do you think people can distinguish a cult from perhaps a different kind of organization that might be immersive, perhaps in the way that a cult is, but isn't necessarily pathological, isn't necessarily going to cause harm to that individual?
Well, I tend to think of organizations on a continuum, and I think there's nothing that's actually fully safe in life. You can do a psychotherapy training and feel harmed by it. You can go to a church and feel harmed by it, or you can do a psychotherapy training and it can be really life enhancing and very, very good and have a great career from it. And the same with church, the same with political following. So it needs to be safe enough, pinching Winnicott's good enough mothering thing. It needs to be safe enough so that there's a level of safety. What's the difference? Probably you can leave. If you can't leave, if you don't check before you go in that you can get out, then you're in trouble.
And by your definition, I got the sense as well that control is quite a persistent theme. And even from your story, what it sounded like was control for control's sake, not necessarily control for any particular aim. Because you can imagine in a group, you might need to control the actions of members for a purpose. Like in the military, you have a chain of command to achieve a strategic objective. But what really struck me about your story and the stories of other cult survivors I've heard is that it's control for its own sake to break the will of the participant.
Actually, it's both, I think, for many groups, because one other part of the definition really is there's a mission, there's a reason for that group existing. And often people join these groups because they sound good. It sounds great to we're going to save the planet, or we're going to save mankind, or we're going to have better health, or we're going to have better mental health. So there's often that mixture, actually. I think they're very often mission driven. It depends probably a lot on the leader. If the leader's very narcissistic and wants the followers, one term that was used by a guy called Zablocki was deployable agents. And the thing is, you get somebody into this very dependent, malleable state of mind within a thought reform system, which is a sort of that there are 8 components of thought reform, which all kind of work together to create this total control. And then you've got some people to actually do your work for you. And one example is the Jesus Army. So I was involved in the documentary Inside the Cult of the Jesus Army, which is on BBC iPlayer. And it's a very good example of the leader was a Christian leader, but he was also a very good businessman. And over 40 years, this small church, which it was a church, and it was a sort of Christian charismatic group, Bible-based, he accrued £120 million. I think that's the correct amount. Now, most churches are trying to pay for the roof, and they can't get the money in. This guy really raked in the money. And part of the reason is he used people as, really, it's modern day slavery. The people who've left now, and the documentary makes this very clear, is that they have no pension, they have no home, they did jobs, and they they worked for free without payment for the cult, but then they asked the government for their benefits, and all of those benefits were paid into the cult. It's an absolute shower. It's disgraceful. And that was for a mission. So they were sold a mission. We're here to create this kind of alternative society, and they did in many ways. But unfortunately, there was abuse in that setting.
Do you agree with the notion that some people might be more vulnerable to joining an organization like this than others? And if so, what might predispose someone to being more vulnerable?
So the literature and the research shows that vulnerability is not so much in personality, but in life experiences. So look, are we vulnerable when we go for therapy? Yes, we are. We're the one who's looking for help. And there are therapists who become cult leaders. And are we vulnerable when we're seeking spiritual enlightenment or to have a relationship with a god or whatever? I suppose we are. So I often, people talk about deceptive recruitment techniques, that you think you're going into something that's okay, and then you find that it's not. But I use this analogy, a frog, if you throw it into hot water, you can imagine it would jump out if it could. But if it stays in if it's just heated up slowly, it's not going to be able to jump out. And I think there's a lot of that. And then you have groups like mine, which evolved into a cult. So they weren't things that weren't a cult to start with. So there's many scenarios that kind of create vulnerability. Sometimes you're just in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Yes, and I suppose irrespective of individual vulnerabilities, feels like there is something innately human about being seduced by a charismatic leader, notions of truth, notions of certainty, notions of metaphysical certainty, knowing what life is all about. Feels like on some level we're all kind of vulnerable to being part of a group that can define our reality so neatly and so tightly, whereas most of the time, by ourselves, especially if a person's not religious, we're kind of adrift in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, that is true. And then you just have to remember as well that there are many, many people coming forward now who were born into the cults. They are really speaking up. I mean, there's a real pushback now, and they're the ones who did not choose to go into this. And again, in the Jesus Army documentary, that's really clearly stated, I didn't ask for this shit, but I'm left with it. I was born into this. And we have to remember them. And then the multi-generation ones who are born into these very old groups that their great-grandparents joined, and the families just being dependent on the group right down the generations.
Do we know anything about people being born into cults in terms of are they worse off? Is it harder for them to recover? Is it harder for them to claim a sense of agency or mental independence if they've born into a cult as opposed to joining a cult as an adult?
There's a big distinction because they have no experience from before. So for me, I had experience from before the group. I can pull on something that's not the cult. But for them, they've got nothing to pull on. And there was a piece of research done by Dr. Lois Kendall, who actually evidenced in her PhD research that second and multi-generation really struggle harder. And I would say I've seen that in the therapy work. I think I'll talk about my walking free model, but I've seen that it's very helpful, but it needs particular application because the issues around identity, just thinking of identity in a very simple way. Look, it's a very complex subject. People who listen to this podcast are going to all have their own versions of theories about identity. And the identity is changed. You have to be you have to do and be a particular person to belong to a particular group. You can't just go in there and say, oh, well, I'm just going to do my own thing, because that doesn't match the vision and the mission of the leader. And that gets squashed, and it gets, I think it gets really crushed and overlaid with a cultic introjected pseudo identity. I think we introject an identity that And that was certainly true for me. And I think for second and multi-generation, they grow up with the cult as their identity. Mostly. I mean, everybody has seeds or kernels of themselves, but often they say they don't. They don't feel as if they have anything of themselves. And so part of the work with them is helping them to say, well, actually, it's very simple, but you were good at art and Fred Bloggs wasn't. That's something that identifies something of you that's not theirs. And they can be like, okay, what gives you pleasure? Well, what do you like, pink or do you like blue? Or do you like going to horror films or do you like going to see romantic film, like really simple, basic kind of ways of trying to help them to see actually there is something of me that's different to others.
And it strikes me that might be a useful part of the definition of a cult. Like if someone's trying to decide, is an organization good for me or bad, one litmus test, if you like, might be, is this group crushing or suppressing or discouraging the identity of the participants or not?
If you can tell at the front door, that's the thing, is the front face of it. In the Bible talks about wolves in sheep's clothing. It's that sort of great sort of metaphor or analogy, and the organization is often a wolf in sheep's clothing. Yoga groups. I know of people who've ended up through their yoga classes. Look, it doesn't happen that much, but it does happen. And they've ended up giving all their money to the group. And I've heard 2 stories where the partner within a family completely separated from their children and their partner and were completely swallowed up into the cult, convinced they were doing the right thing.
So that might be another red flag, that if the cult is encouraging you to cut off from all outsiders, then surely that's something to be aware of and to be afraid of.
Run for your life. If it's hard to leave, run for your life. And if they're encouraging you, telling you your children are evil or sinful or a negative influence on the world, run for your life and get away, because it's not worth the toll that it takes on everybody. And one of the other things in my definition is, engenders an us and them mentality, fear and rejection of the world outside the group, but then causes psychological harm to members, their families, the community, including children. They're very dangerous. It's very dangerous.
What do you think is the biggest psychological harm that can be caused by a cult?
There's so many, anxiety or depression or paranoia or what you could just carry on listing forever. But what I like to say is that when you're working with someone from these settings, you need to consider the context in which these mental health issues, if we call them that, or these harms has occurred. Because I am not a fearful person now. I'm really not. But after I left the cult and we continued going to churches, I was terrified. And I was terrified in the cult. And I put that down to my introjected kind of pseudo-cultic identity. And so in the work with these clients, we need to be looking at the context and the source of these things, because they may not actually be mental health issues.
Right.
And I co-authored a chapter with Dr. Nicola Crowley in a book called Spirituality and Psychiatry, which is a textbook for psychiatrists. And we talked about that in there. Pathological spirituality was the name of the chapter, and just sort of you can list all these things, but actually a lot of them are actually not really embedded in that person's actual personality or identity, or wherever you would place it.
I'm interested in this idea of pathological spirituality. Can you tell me more about it?
Well, I think we wanted to kind of acknowledge that spirituality can be life enhancing. For some people, spirituality, faith, religion, whatever, is for some people very life enhancing. Meditation may be life enhancing. But then you get this pathological side where, the cults, high demand abusive groups and the leadership come in with their agenda and start micromanaging people's lives for their own ends. And it might be sexual ends, it might be financial ends, it's all sorts.
I tend to believe that most people have some sort of spiritual drive, or at the very least a drive for meaning, transcendence, etc. So it sounds like you're saying these groups can hijack our desire for greater meaning in order to achieve whatever their aims happen to be.
Absolutely. And I think people who've been in political cults may not fully agree with this, but I think there is an element always of hijacking spirituality and therapeutic, that often there are therapeutic themes within these cults saying we'll make you better, we'll heal you, we'll transform you, something's going to move and happen within you, but actually it doesn't. One of my PhD participants said something really interesting. I wish I had the quote here, but she said more or less, I went into the cult with all my baggage, all the stuff I needed to sort out. I went into it thinking they'd sort it out. And then this person was what we call a castaway. She was thrown out of the group because she wasn't complying or something. And she said, when I got through the door, metaphorically speaking, there was all my baggage sitting on the doorstep. So first generation, she had to come out now, and she then had to pick up all this stuff and start the process of healing herself, because none of this had been healed. And then she had this on top of it.
It occurs to me that I guess two things that might be good inoculation against the cult would be things like critical thinking and also agency. So an ability to discern, what is the reality around me? What do I want? How do I move towards what I want? Do you worry that, even putting cults aside for a second, society doesn't encourage a whole lot of critical thinking or agency? Is that something you worry about?
Yeah, definitely. And I think myself and a lot of others who work in this field very specifically talk about going into schools. One of my colleagues who left a cult herself, she did a whole course on critical thinking and was saying, really, we need to take this into the schools, the idea of debating. The public schools, and a lot of public school people, boarding school people end up in cults as well. So it hasn't been completely, they haven't been immune to it. But, sort of debating societies, that idea that you don't just take things at face value, you debate it. But even then they get through that. It's tricky. It's very tricky.
Do we have any idea how many cults are currently operative within the UK?
I think it's hard to really quantify. The Cult Information Centre, which is now closed, used to say not that long ago there were about 500 kind of listed cults in the UK. Similar numbers sort of pro rata to America. It's not an American issue. It's a UK issue. It's an international issue. And when I was at the University of Nottingham and telling people what my research was, do you know how many people say, oh, yes, we have a cult, or my cousin was in a cult, or I nearly joined a cult, or it's fascinating, and you think actually it's way more prevalent than you realise. And the point I made, that the house that I was in the community was just an ordinary terraced house, and no one around knew. They probably thought we were weird, truthfully, but they didn't know what was happening in there. So who knows? Who knows how many domestic abuse relationships there are? For the nature of them, they're hidden.
Yes, they can seem like totally normal at first glance, and yet horrific things could be happening behind closed doors.
And that was true of the Jesus Army. I'm mentioning that because if your listeners are interested in seeing a bit more about cults, those who are in the UK, I know there are probably others who can't access it yet, but it really is a clear example of what is a cult and how it evolved and the leader.
Do you ever get pushback from cults because you speak out against them? Do you ever get threatening emails or anything like that?
I don't, because I don't name cults publicly. The only cults I'll name is if they're in the public domain, like the Jesus Army has folded, and so they're a good example and I can name them. I do know, I did an internship in America at Wellspring Retreat and Resource Centre twice. I went there in 1999 and 2008, and they were the only mental health facility in the world who worked with former members. And that's really where I cut my teeth and learnt a model that I've built on. And they would get, they had a particular cult, I won't mention, that's harasses people a great deal. The cult had hired a helicopter, found where the centre was in the middle of the woods, the boonies they called it. The Americans will understand that term. And they found the place, and they would send people with placards and all sorts. They had to put gates out around the lodge. They had a facility, the lodge and the office. So they would speak out. So, yeah, cults are very litigious, and it's important. I teach my students who I teach on the certificate who do learning my model, be really careful who you name.
It occurs to me, thinking out loud, the sort of biggest religion I can think of that seems to have a lot of cult-like properties, to me, seems like Scientology. Would you be willing to comment or not whether you think Scientology is a cult?
Let me just put it like this. Lots of people have alleged that Scientology is a cult. And yes, I've worked with people who've said it is a cult.
Fair enough. I'm interested in this idea of thought reform, which you've talked about. And thought reform for the listeners is, it sounds like brainwashing. What are the main sort of principles of thought reform?
So thought reform is a theory that was developed through research with Korean and Chinese prisoners of war by Dr. Robert J. Lifton. He's written his work, he's just died actually, and he's worth looking up for anyone who's a psychiatrist or a psychologist or whatever. He did research into the Nazi doctors, into Hiroshima, and then into cults, but also into the Korean and Chinese prisoners of war. And he developed this idea of, through his research, he identified these 8 components. And the first one is milieu control, which is control of the environment, physical energy, what you wear, what you eat. And then control of communication outside of the group. And this is a key thing as well, and came through my story, I hope, sort of cutting off communication within oneself. So that kind of inner dialogue gets suppressed, doubt, suppress it quick, that kind of thing. And then you have mystical manipulation is the second component, which is kind of talking about the leadership, really elevating themselves, coming over as a prophet or the answer to the world's problems, that kind of hubris, that narcissism that they have the answers. They can magic things, like Sai Baba would say he could manifest gold watches in midair. Well, so can Derren Brown. I don't know, Derren Brown's a really entertaining stage hypnotist, and who kind of debunked a lot of this stuff. But within that, there's also altered states of consciousness. And Fritz Perls actually said that being confluent or merged within a group or relationship is a state of trance that we're not actually processing in a normal way. because we've lost I think in Gestalt terms, we've lost our teeth.
Our ability to discern.
To chew, discern, to have critical thinking. We've become dependent. So these altered states of consciousness can also be elicited through endless meditation, through endless, probably sex as well, and probably also singing hymns endlessly. Like in our kind of in the community, you would just be singing the same chorus over and over, and you're kind of like lulled into a hypnotic trance, and then you just literally drink in, take in everything that's said to you. You're not debating it, you're just taking it in. Then there's sacred science, which is the belief system. And that the reason he used the science word is because it's like the big T truth. This is the truth. This is how we see the world. This is true. There's no other way of seeing it. Black and white thinking. And then there's doctrine over person, where the doctrine is way more important than the individual. You know, the individual doesn't really matter. So for me, the doctrine, like being beaten for sin, that's doctrine over person. You know, the fact that that's really not going to be helpful for anybody, but they need to follow the doctrine. Then there's a demand for purity as defined by the group. So my group defined purity in terms of religious sin, that sort of thing, but it may be like within a therapeutic group, it might be mental purity. You need to be very healthy as they define it, which isn't actually what it is. And then in response to the demand for purity comes confession. And confession goes beyond the normal legal or therapeutic sort of manifestation of confession to a fact. So I confessed when I got beaten, and then I ended up being punished for that. So the purity was demanded. I freaked out and confessed, maybe it's me that's sinning, and then I got punished. So confession can also be reiterating negative introjects, negative things we believe about ourselves. And then loading the language, which I'd mentioned. The language is loaded in such a way as it's a cliched thought-stopping language. So it's really tricky when somebody sees a client who is from a cult and they don't understand that they may be talking about completely different things. The word might be the same, but actually it's a whole different world, and it sets off a real big trigger.
Right. So, for example, in Scientology, they'll often call someone outside of Scientology who they disagree with a quote-unquote suppressive person. So that sounds like an example of loading the language.
Exactly, because no one else knows what that means. I mean, if someone said that to me, I'd think, I wonder what they mean. But that is correct. And then the last one, I think I've got them all, is dispensing of existence. So Lifton said, you know, it can be rendered sort of altruistic in that, like that thing of the suicide bombers render literally dying, dispensing of someone's existence as being something, you know, that they'll go to Nirvana or wherever it was they were going, which ties in with milieu control, the kind of closing the borders of the group, dispensing of the existence of outsiders. They don't count, they don't know, we're not going to learn from them. But also it then happens also on micro levels within the cult. So, I mean, my existence was dispensed with, you know, so often. You don't count, you're a woman. You know, it's happening all the time.
Hearing those principles of thought reform, it's pretty scary. It strikes me that they would be pretty effective. Do you think that these kinds of principles can also be present in some combinations in just one-on-one abusive relationships, that abusers can, I would imagine, unconsciously use principles like this to coerce and control?
Absolutely, yes. And, you know, it's coercive control, you know, if you look at it from another direction. And if you look at which I'm sure a lot of people have, the definition of coercive control. Many of these things are in there, monitoring people's phones, withholding money, like so much can happen within a one-on-one. And sometimes I have worked with people in a one-on-one cult that can occasionally have this religious element and therefore takes it slightly beyond coercive control into really being fully a one-on-one cult. But it's very much tied up together.
Now, you're the founder of Hope Valley Counselling, and part of what you guys do is help people recover after they've been part of a cult. How do people find you typically?
Well, the internet's good, isn't it?
I guess what I'm wondering is there a common story that people come to you with?
I mean, yes. It's often people have been out for a very long time. They've had lots of therapy. The therapists, they haven't helped because they don't know what the client's talking about. And then with first generation, occasionally they've been, to a therapist who then starts talking about their childhood. The client's gone to talk about the cult, but if they have a psychoanalytic bent, they want to talk about why you joined the cult. Well, one of my participants in my PhD said it was like pulling the rug from under her feet because, she was trying to after 19 years of being in a cult, she was trying to rebuild her relationship with her parents, who she'd been separated from. And then the therapist started talking about, what did your parents do to cause you to join the cult, and blaming the parents. Whereas, look, that can happen later. And if you want, I can mention the phases of recovery. But, that's not the first step to working with these people.
Because actually, however flawed their childhood may have been, that's maybe the only foundation of identity that they have that they need to reclaim first.
Exactly. And actually, what they need to do first is to understand the dynamics of the cult. And can I mention quickly the phases? This came out of my PhD, and it's very simple. And the first phase is the need to leave physically. You need to get out. If you can possibly get out, get away as far as you can.
Do you ever have clients approach you when they're still in the cult?
Occasionally. I have people, so the ex-Jehovah's Witnesses call it physically in, mentally out, PMO, physically in, mentally out. They're just starting to leave. So it's complex, but the simple look at it, the cartoon version, is leave. And if you're in a domestic abuse relationship, you need to leave because you're going to just continue being brainwashed, continue being harmed. Then phase 2 is the need to understand psychologically. And that's where my model fits. My book, Walking Free, all of the psychoeducational work fits in phase 2. Understand what happened to you, identify what belongs to the cultic introjected identity and what belongs to your authentic identity, is what I call it, using Gestalt view. Then what was your identity within the group? What can you identify that actually was you, but what was you that had to be very compliant? And I became very compliant, as I said. I really lost myself. And losing my family also meant that I lost so much of myself. Then we look at who are you now post-cult. And it's very simple. And we keep going back to the worksheets throughout this phase of therapy. Like if something comes up and they say, oh, I really loved going to the football match. I'm like, yes, let's stick that on the sheet. You loved going to the football match. I don't like going to football matches. And sometimes I'll reflect that back to them and say, look, this is different. We're different. Let's capture those things. But what we're doing is really looking at what's an introject. An introject is a belief or behavior that we've swallowed whole and we haven't chewed over, and it's sitting in our system and it's causing distress. So we look at all that. We look at trauma theory, we look at thought reform. We go through thought reform in real detail, and by the time they finish the workbook, I have a shortened version I use in therapy of my book, which is what the book started with. It was first of all this recovery workbook, and then I wrote it up into a book. But it's very effective. The feedback is very positive for me, and also for the therapists who use it that I've trained, which is very encouraging.
That's fascinating. So it sounds like you're trying to help the client develop anchor points of things that reflect their values. Like, I love football, I hate politics, trying to get them to use their strong emotions as important signals about who they are as a person, something like that.
I mean, it's probably simpler than that, partly because the whole thing of emotions is very complex for former members. Therapists are taught to go, and how do you feel about that? What you'll get is dissociation or terror, because they've been taught within the thought reform system and within the milieu control to suppress their emotions and their thoughts. And so it's a delicate balance of bringing certain psychoeducational, psychological theories to them that are very relevant, and then helping them to chew those over, to think, does this apply to me? Doesn't it? Was it a cult? Wasn't it a cult? So I'm never telling them this happened to you. It's always for them to kind of chew over. And that's phase 2. Phase 3 is what we do as therapists, what we learn on our psychotherapy trainings. Once the person understands what belongs to the cult, what belongs to me, do I understand it enough to now move into the phase where I can then process the trauma, process the feelings, process anxiety. Oh gosh, isn't anxiety? It's actually a traumatic trigger. Actually, it's the loaded language that's triggering me. Actually, I can challenge the triggers. I can ground myself. Actually, I don't have to be tangled up in that anymore. I can move forward in my life. And then phase 4 is recognizing that we're recovered enough to get on with our life.
Wow. Okay. So it's like phase 1 is leaving. Phase 2 is starting to distinguish your identity from the cult identity. Phase 3 is more typical psychotherapy stuff, processing difficult emotions, traumas, gaining emotional literacy. And then phase 4 is recognition that you can now sort of continue to live your life. Do I have that right?
That's right. It's really understanding. And, obviously I can't show you the book because we're talking, but it has in it those different worksheets. I've called them milestones because I based the book on a roadmap, an actual map that we drew to show the process of recovery. And look, not everything will apply to everyone, and not everyone will like every single thing, but it's an attempt to really encapsulate all the things that I've heard over the years.
And I'm sure it varies for everyone, but how long typically might it take for someone to get from stage 1 through to 4?
It does really vary. It probably depends on the level of trauma and, what happened to them within the cult. Like, often there's sexual abuse, and it depends whether they're second or first generation. The phases create a focus for therapy. That's what it is. It's a focus. What do you focus on in these? That's not to say you don't process emotions as you go through phase 2. I mean, you do. Obviously, you have to. But it's not, you're not there saying, how do you feel about that? The feelings may come up, they may not. And that makes it more grounding for them. With the shorter version of the workbook, that can be done in maybe 20 hours. Sometimes I'll do an intensive with people. Sometimes I did 2 weeks. Someone came from Australia. We did 2 weeks. Somebody else, I did 2 weeks. That's when I had more time. But sometimes I'll do a long weekend and we'll go through the workbook. I've just done a 5-day workshop with therapists with lived experience to teach them the model, but they experienced it for themselves as a client. And then I'm going to teach them in the next sections how to use the model. It's very effective. It really shifts people.
If a person is trying to recover from being part of a cult and they have the choice, they have the option, do you think immersive treatments like 2-week retreats, do you think they're better? Do you think they have better outcomes?
For some people. It's not right for some. Some people need a very slow, steady pace, and some people have the resilience, or they've done enough work on themselves in some ways that they're then ready. So it really needs to be it needs to be individually placed. But we have run recovery workshops for a group of people, and that was also very effective. Life goes on, shit still happens, people struggle with things, but they get that phase 2 information that then can create a bit more of a base for them as they go forward in life.
Do you think cult survivors are vulnerable to relapse? Is that something people should be aware of? That just because someone's escaped a cult, it doesn't mean they're not vulnerable to going back into one?
Absolutely. What we call it cult hopping. And very often you hear, and this is why it's so essential that therapists learn about this stuff, because these people, me included, these people, go from one abusive setting into another because they don't recognize the dynamics. They haven't understood what happened to them. And so people will end up in an abusive relationship when they leave a cult. Honestly, it happens so often.
This is a bit of a loaded question, but I feel inclined to ask it. Do you worry that there seem to be cult-like aspects to a lot of our culture, to our politics emerging, that even in the facets of life that most people engage with on some level, there are aspects that are indoctrinating, are coercive or controlling?
There are elements. We know there are elements in politics. We won't go into it all, but and conspiracy theories, and whose conspiracy theories, someone else's truth, and misinformation and that sort of thing. I think the thing about thought reform is I see it as a machine. It's a system, and there can be elements of that system within different settings, but it's not. What I don't want to do is, dissolve, water down the enormity of what a cult is for someone who's fully been in a cult. Because, yes, there are elements, but I remember someone saying to me, when I started my PhD, this person said to me, well, aren't all church leaders cult leaders?
That's the common refrain, like, aren't all religions cults, etc.
Yeah, but, you're like, they clearly have no nuance in this or understanding. Of course, not all leaders are cult leaders. Not all church leaders are cult leaders. Because, as I say, it just waters down and makes it ridiculous.
I mean, many leaders, religious, non-religious leaders of organizations, have the well-being of the individuals in their group or organization in mind. And I guess if we know what defines a cult, we know certainly that wanting the real well-being and the thriving of the people in your organization is clearly not what a cult is about typically.
And people make mistakes, and no organization, we said before about the sort of continuum, there can be a healthy organization that harms some people because that person is particularly vulnerable in a particular way. Or somebody may mishandle them, or somebody comes into that organization who's very controlling, and the main leadership are like, I've heard that happening with, quite a normal, healthy church. And then the youth leader comes in and starts controlling everybody, telling them they mustn't have sex. And they're like, we've employed the wrong person, and then they have to repair it. But they do repair it, and that's the difference.
You've trained as a Gestalt psychotherapist, and that's part of my training as well. I guess what's cool about Gestalt for helping people survive cults is Gestalt helps people feel into that sense of who am I distinct from another person, and how do I form a relationship with another person that's healthy, which is obviously very helpful because in a cult you're being confluent, which is a Gestalt term for you're kind of enmeshed with the group, and therefore it's hard for you to distinguish yourself from the people around you as a sovereign person.
I love that. See, for me, look, we're all human beings who come into training as therapists with our own stuff. And so we have to deal with our stuff at the same time, and hopefully we do. And having been confluent and having been a good girl and always having to do what I'm told, it was person-centered wouldn't have worked for me because there wasn't enough of a presence of the therapist there. And so that distinguishing me from you and me from my client, and that's what I was saying earlier when I'll say, oh, well, I don't like football. That is actually defining my boundaries and giving them a sense, actually, I'm different to you, and it's okay. I can be different. I can hear about the football, but don't ask me to go because I really don't want to.
Yeah, I guess person-centered therapy requires the client to have a reasonably robust sense of self to start. That's what I've always thought.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I don't know. I have studied it a long time ago when I did my diploma in pastoral counselling. But I've loved Gestalt, and I'm sorry it's not so popular here in the UK now. There's many less courses, and it is actually a fantastic approach. And it was a pushback to psychoanalysis, and somebody telling the client, just, which is again a cartoon version, but that sort of feeling of interpretation and always going back to childhood. And it's much more in the here and now, Gestalt, and which is a much more modern idea of mindfulness. There's elements of Buddhism in there.
Do you think the NHS is doing enough to support people who have survived cults or to help them get out?
No, in big letters. Do you know, for the first time ever, somebody's just contacted me from a NHS trust saying they want to make provision for people who are leaving these situations, and could they do my certificate? And I've said, the thing is, for the certificate, it's for people with lived experience. Do you know, it cuts out so much discussion, having somebody, I guess, like myself, who's been through a cult, who's trained as a therapist, and then who wants to work with them. Because they get it. They know the depth of control. And I mean, I have trained other therapists, and I do, and I will. I'll do another training next year, and just ordinary therapy just isn't enough. It really isn't enough.
In an ideal world, would you envision that the NHS would have something like a national cult survivors clinic, similar to the way we have a national gambling addiction clinic? Do you think, if you were a policymaker, is that the kind of service you would envision?
It would be amazing to have that.
Well, hopefully some policymakers are listening to this and they've been informed. We're out of time. Gillie, it's been wonderful to have you back. I feel like I learned so much that I didn't know. And I feel that should I ever, encounter any of these issues in my practice, I feel I'm that much more prepared to do so. Thank you very much for coming back on. I will put a number of the online resources you've shared in the description so that if anyone has been affected by these issues, they have a place to start. Thank you so much for joining me again.
It's been such a pleasure. I've really enjoyed our conversation.